Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda, where we're joined now by, in my opinion at least, two people on the back bench that should be on the front bench. They can't say it, but I will. Nick Champion representing the Labor Party and Kelly O'Dwyer for the Liberals. Welcome to the program. Let's start, I guess, on Indonesia before we move into wider issues after this first fortnight of sittings. Nick Champion, you're the Deputy Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Did Labor go the wrong way by raising this in Parliament so quickly and linking the Obama-German Merkel situation to what we're going through now? Because it looks like there's a pretty fast retreat in most quarters from that analysis.
Well, look, I think the two things we did was to say, well, we're not going to comment on the intelligence matters, and we're going to support the government to fix this very important relationship. It's important to the country in economic terms, in defence terms, in security terms. And also in the exchange of people that go back and forth between the two countries. And we've never been prescriptive about how it might be resolved. So I think as far as oppositions can be, we've played a Team Australia game, and that we've been supportive of the government and given them the room to resolve this issue.
Still your view and Labor's view more broadly that the apology, or at least that the exchange, should be similar to what happened between Merkel and Obama? Because that's not what Abbott has done.
Yeah, and we've never been prescriptive. We've just pointed out that that's the way other nations have resolved these matters. Clearly there's going to be something of a different a different way of resolving this, or we're not going to be prescriptive about it. We're going to support the government to mend this important relationship.
But by raising the Obama-Merkel example, presumably Labor is really endorsing this and offering this as a way Abbott should move forward.
Well, it's an example of diplomacy, isn't it? I mean, and that's really what we want is creative diplomacy to resolve this issue. And I think that's an important thing for the opposition to do. But let's not forget, the opposition's not governing the country. This is the government's, and properly so, the government's issue to resolve.
To what extent in Labor ranks is there a sense of responsibility here, given that this happened during the period of Labor government?
Well, look, there's a broader responsibility, I guess, on the nation state and politicians of all colours to be responsible about this and to back in the national interest. And the national interest is to put this relationship back on track.
Kelly O'Dwyer, national interest being to put the relationship back on track. Whatever you think about how it happened, when it happened, why it happened, and how much it goes on now, I guess, as well on all sides, was this an example of Tony Abbott being a little bit flat-footed, where he could have gotten out faster in trying to appease Indonesia to avoid the escalation that we have seen this week?
No, Peter, I don't agree with that analysis. I think that Tony Abbott has behaved in a very appropriate manner. We are dealing with this very serious relationship at the highest possible levels, as we should. The Prime Minister is directly dealing with the President of Indonesia. It is one of our most important relationships. It's one of our most important strategic relationships, trading relationships.
But can I ask a question on that? If it's such an important relationship, as all sides seem to keep saying, then surely we have to be prepared to say publicly that we're not going to tap the phone of the wives of presidents or the husbands of presidents out of Indonesia to maintain a relationship, because I couldn't imagine getting on well with anybody whose wife's phone you were tapping from a nation-to-nation level.
Well, look, there's been a long-standing convention. It's not just our government that's done this, but the previous governments as well, not to discuss intelligence matters and not to comment on them. And we're continuing in that vein. We're not going to make comments on that. What we are going to do, though, is focus on the relationship, make sure that we have a good, strong, warm and deep relationship with Indonesia. And it's entirely appropriate that Tony Abbott is directing our response by directly communicating with the President of Indonesia.
The Indonesian president, however, indicated that he was dissatisfied with Tony Abbott's response. So, in that sense, there seems to be a very strong case that Abbott didn't provide a fully adequate answer.
Well, there has been an exchange of letters, and there hasn't been commentary, I think, after that, Paul, but there has been a direct exchange of letters. Diplomacy is best done from the highest possible levels, from person to person, from Prime Minister to President. That's what's occurring now, and I think that that's an entirely appropriate response.
So do you agree then, perhaps, for example, with Mark Textor, that it was wrong for you to go on a particular aspect of what he tweeted, where he tweeted that he well, I'll paraphrase him. What on earth is a president doing using Twitter to make statements? Yidi Ono, on the analysis that you put before, was doing the wrong thing. He wasn't dealing person to person with our Prime Minister. He was coming out and using Twitter.
Well, look, I'm not going to make a comment on the Indonesian president, and certainly I think it's fair to say that the comments by Mark Textor have been repudiated, including by Mark Textor himself. So I'm not sure that that was terribly helpful in the diplomatic stakes.
I'd like to ask you both about backbench opinion in relation to the car industry. This is one of the big issues before the government now, the question being whether more subsidy, more public support is given to the car sector. And it seems very, very clear that the industry itself is more uncompetitive now than it's been in the past. What's your view on that particular issue?
Well, look, my personal view is one that I've articulated in articles that I've written. I certainly think that we have spent billions of dollars in supporting the car industry, and these were meant to be very temporary government assistance offers to the car industry to put it on a sustainable footing. I think it's entirely appropriate we look at the record of that assistance, and that's what the government is doing by making sure that we have a full review conducted by the Productivity Commission. We have already seen Mitsubishi leave. Ford has said it's pulling out, and this was after the government gave it an extra $34 million with no strings attached. And Holden is threatening to do the same if it's not given another handout by the government. We need to ask ourselves the question, what are we actually getting for the money that we're spending? Will it make it a sustainable industry? What is in fact going to change between what we were doing in the past and what we're doing now, particularly when production has actually decreased?
What are the arguments in response to that, Nick Champion? Because I know you take a different view, and your electorate obviously takes in an awful lot of Holden workers there in Wakefield.
Well, look, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, Kelly and the Liberal Party don't have any problem with subsidies to industry when it's for the private health industry, or whether it's for the mining industry or agriculture in terms of the diesel fuel rebate, which is worth about $55 billion or something over the last 10 years. I mean, huge concessions and support for particular industries. You don't see a lot of debate within the Liberal Party about those particular measures. So I think there's a certain level of hypocrisy in some of the, dialogue within the Liberal Party. And the other thing I think is that this is a government that's divided on foreign investment. In the car industry, they're divided on whether or not they want to get it. In grain, they're divided on, whether they want it or not on a different measure. So there's some really strange debates going on within the coalition, between the Nationals and Liberals, between wets and dries.
But let's focus on your views, though. Let's focus on your views. Now, as far as you're concerned, are you prepared to see more subsidies to the industry, even though there are going to be no exports being produced? It looks as though it's a welfare industry. Are you prepared to see more taxpayers' money go into the car sector?
Well, I'd reject those terms. I mean, you've got to understand that this is nearly all a currency-induced crisis for the car industry. Our currency
that's the only issue.
Well, just let me finish. Our currency's gone up substantially. It's not just causing issues for the car industry, it's causing issues for manufacturing and food, it's causing issues for wine, for exporters of grain and hay.
But it's come down in recent weeks, and we haven't seen any reappraisal by Holden.
Well, not to the level it should be at. And
so
the Reserve Bank's saying it's too high. They're frustrated with it. They're flagging intervention. We've had the Japanese, in straight terms, we've had the Japanese lowering their currency, and so cars that come out of Japan are quarter, by that's a differential, a quarter cheaper than they were a year ago. At the same time, our currency is very, very high, and that causes an issue for exports.
But there's so little we can do about that.
It causes an issue for import competition. And the second thing I'd say to you, Paul, is there's not a car on the road that's not subsidised by taxpayers. BMWs are,
sure.
American cars are. Around the world, if nations want a car industry, they subsidise it. Now, that's because it's very, very capital intensive, and because the returns are not the same as what they are in other industries. You can have a debate about whether that's desirable across the world, but I think that's a different debate about whether or not we want a car industry.
So what's your response to the argument about the currency?
Well, look, I mean, listening to Nick's argument, he listed off a whole range of industries that are affected by the high Australian dollar. So presumably, based on that logic, we should be giving them all huge subsidies
Well,
as
but
well.
many of them are subsidised. though. What do you think?
But you're talking about providing massive ongoing subsidies to the car industry without actually exploring what it is that is making the industry uncompetitive and unsustainable right now. To simply blame it on the high Australian dollar is not looking at the full picture. I think there have been a number of articles that have been written talking about wages and conditions in the car industry, and that is one. Well, that is one element clearly that we need to look at and explore whether or not in Australia this is different to countries overseas, and whether this makes our car industry
That's a fair point, Nick Champion.
uncompetitive.
When Australian workers do get paid a lot more than...
When the BRACS report came out, it showed our workers about middle of the pack, certainly under the US and Germany in terms of their wage rates. Since then, the dollar's affected that competitiveness. Holden's management asked the workers and this is not the first time they've asked workers to make sacrifices. During the GFC, people worked 1 week on, 1 week off. It'd be hard-pressed to find a workplace that's more flexible than that. And they asked for $15 million worth of savings at the plant per year, and that's what they got. So, I mean, I think this wages issue is a complete furphy.
All right, hold that thought. We need to take a break, but when we come back, we might move on from the car industry. I've got a sneaking suspicion we're not going to get you to agreeing on that. But something that we're probably also not going to get agreement on, which we'll discuss when we come back, is, of course, the debt ceiling. There has continued to be a standoff in the federal parliament in relation to raising it to $500 billion. We'll discuss it when we come back.
Experience the quality of Nespresso, and you will let no one compromise your pleasure.
May I?
Please.
It's a Voluto.
It was.
Do you want me to...
Oh, so nice of you. Mr.
George. My name's George.
George Clooney's inside!
Nespresso. What else?
You don't have to go to Mexico to enjoy the authentic flavours of real Mexican food. You only have to go to your nearest supermarket. Mission, the real taste of Mexico since 1959.
The family kitchen. Heart of the home since fire, language and grandma. Once reserved for the day stories, dad's cheesy jokes and mum's quiche disaster. Now it's storage for leftover takeaway and whatever sis isn't eating. Now she's in high school. Shut up. You shut up. This used to be the place we made that family dish we call memories. I say it can be so again.
To celebrate the different drivers of New South Wales, if you switch your comprehensive car insurance to GIO, you can get a year's free upgrade to GIO Platinum Car Insurance. It's only available by calling 13 10 10. GIO, it's a trust thing.
Don't miss your one-off opportunity to take advantage of exceptional BMW value during the BMW One program, like 1% comparison rate finance on the ultimate driving machine, the 3 Series sedan. It's the last days for these one-off opportunities, so hurry in now.
Introducing McDonald's new Real Choices Chicken and Spicy Mayo McWrap. With hand-picked tomatoes, spicy mayo, crispy or grilled 100% Australian chicken wrapped in a warm tortilla. For just $5.95, but you better believe it, good.
Slippers, mate. Mate?
No one likes fungal nail infections, but now there's a file-free solution. New Rejuvenail kills the fungus without needing to file your nails first. New Rejuvenail. Do your nails a favour.
First time here?
Yeah. Normally I use my Nespresso app.
To be alone. Matt Damon is inside!
Oh, man.
Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda. Well, there has been a fortnight of parliamentary sittings in the new parliament. One of the big issues, one of the big debates where there was disagreement between the major parties was in relation to lifting the debt ceiling. There is still a standoff in place as we move into a period of a break ahead of the last 2 weeks of sittings before the new year. Let's just have a bit of a look at how this debate has unfolded.
Well, we're still in pretty much the same situation in the debt cap as we were when I spoke to you a week ago.
The choice of a $500 billion limit seems prudent.
If we have the certainty, the markets will be happy, investors will be happy. What has changed since the pre-election fiscal outlook?
We previously anticipated the peak plus the within-year buffer to exceed 430 billion. It's now highly likely the quantum required will significantly exceed that amount.
It may well be that half a trillion is required, but to be asked to make that decision sight unseen is simply inappropriate.
The Treasurer is behaving like a spoilt kid.
The Labor Party just doesn't get it. Enough is enough. You did so much damage in government. Don't continue the trend in opposition.
Nick Champion, one of my strongest memories of when Wayne Swan was Treasurer was him constantly hiding behind Treasury and the independent advice of Treasury. There we had the head of Treasury, Martin Parkinson, at a Senate Estimates Committee saying that he thinks that it is prudent to raise the debt limit to $500 billion. How on earth can Labor not just tick that off once they've had that independent confirmation?
Well, you would expect us to properly, when an opposition which opposed every single debt limit, increase, and always demanded high levels of accountability, you expect us as the opposition to require them to substantiate their claims.
Is it just a case of they did it, so we will too?
The interesting thing is, I think, about the sort of justification for this increase was that there are headwinds out of Europe. Those were Joe Hockey's words, and it would seem to me that the only reason that's an acknowledgement of the effects of the global financial crisis, of the impact of the restructuring of the world economy, and I just think that that implicitly they've actually endorsed what's happened on debt, which is as revenues have dropped. We've obviously gone into debt, and that's because of international factors rather than any domestic factors. And I think the other thing about it is we're just sensibly and pretty moderately requiring them to justify these economic conditions.
But Kelly O'Dwyer, it's a bizarre situation because there is an implicit recognition of the need for debt now with raising the ceiling that high from the coalition. It's going to be years before it gets anywhere near $500 billion. And at the same time as that, you can't be surprised that Labor's making your life tough after just how tough every time there was far more moderate increases in the debt ceiling, the Liberals continually threatened to block it.
Well, first let me repudiate what Nick just had to say, because he was making suggestions that Joe Hockey had made claims that he simply hasn't made. I mean, the reason we have to increase the debt ceiling right now is because of the debt we have been left by the previous Labor government. They have been reckless spenders. They even introduced taxes that actually cost more with the associated spending, such as the mining tax, which actually left our budget bottom line $13 billion worse off.
But the debt's only going to get to that 430, 440 mark if your side doesn't cut it. And one of the key mantras ahead of the election was that you would end the wasteful spending. So by definition, if that's to be the case, you don't need that high debt ceiling, surely.
We're certainly going to reduce the size of government, and we're going to make some difficult decisions. That is exactly what the Commission of Audit is all about, going through line by line. But first, let me say this, we have to be prudent right now. There is a real need right now to raise the debt ceiling, and it is because we know that in 2015, according to the pre-election and fiscal outlook, there is going to be a $370 billion peak debt. We know that the Australian Office of Financial... Yeah, but I'm just going through it. The Australian Office of Financial Management has said we need a $60 billion buffer. In addition to that, we know that the previous Labor government depleted the Reserve Bank Reserve Fund, and we've had to top that up by more than $8.8 billion because they ripped dividends out when the money wasn't there, and it actually put the Reserve Bank Reserve Fund at a point where the Governor said it was not appropriate. So we're having to repair a lot of the damage that we have been left, and this is after, of course, we left the previous Labor government with very strong books. We had no net debt, we actually had money in the bank with the Future Fund. The economy was very, very strong. So this is an unfortunate response to what we have been left with.
Isn't Labor playing with fire here, given that the Treasury Secretary has said this is prudent, given that we know that debt is going to go beyond 400 billion, given there are warnings about sentiment in financial markets? I would have thought this is a pretty risky position for Labor.
Well, look, we're not going to give the government a blank cheque to just do whatever they want. And they're saying a $60 billion buffer. Now, you've got to have some justification for that, and it can't just be Joe Hockey telling us there's headwinds out of Europe.
Parkinson, the Treasury Secretary.
But here's the thing. All we're saying is release the mid-year economic outlook, give us appropriate justification.
You mean you'll back down then?
Well, no. Well, what we're asking for is justification for raising it this high. That's not unreasonable.
But we're going to crash through the debt ceiling by December, the 300 billion, after you'd raised it from 75 to 200, 200
but we're
250,
offering you 400 right now.
250 to 300.
You could have 400 right now.
We have to do it appropriately, and we have to do it right first up.
No, you just...
And that's what we've said.
What you want to
we've said you've actually got to think about the entire forward estimates
after campaigning against debt the whole time and telling us you're going to reduce debt the whole time, you then march into the Parliament and ask for a $60 billion buffer. Raising it, $60 billion.
No,
now,
we're
if
not
you're so
asking
confident,
this is the advice that
if you're so confident, well, no, but if you're so confident that this was just a Labor problem and just a spending problem, and not a GFC problem, and not a revenue decline problem, why do you need the $60 billion buffer? And this is, the problem with the government is that they told us one thing before the election, and then they're doing something completely different after the election.
There's been a precedent of that, in fact.
And they just expect everybody to wave it through. Well, I'm sorry.
Can we just clarify the Labor position? It seems to me from what you're saying that this is really just a matter of getting the appropriate information, that Labor's position is actually very flexible. Is that the case or not?
Well, in the package we had the Shadow Assistant Treasurer saying just release the mid-year economic forecasts.
But it's all okay then, isn't it?
Well, just give us justification.
Yes, but previously you said you'd actually change your view if Martin Parkinson came in Treasury in Senate estimates and said that Treasury actually believes it's appropriate or prudent to have a $500 billion debt ceiling, and now you've moved that position again.
We're going to have to move on to the next issue because we're almost out of time, and I wouldn't want to end the program without being able to talk about the carbon tax. It was passed through the lower house with resistance, futile resistance, obviously, given the numbers by the Labor Party. Now, Nick Champion, you were part of that resistance. But initially, after the election defeat, you thought that Labor should have moved in the entirely opposite direction than they have. Have you changed your mind, or have you simply been pulled into line?
Well, look, I think little of column A, little of column B. Look, clearly my party had a preference for emissions trading system. They've had that preference since 2007, and I think it's economically and technically it is the most efficient way of dealing with climate change. We're now going to move to a position where we're going to deal with it in a very inefficient way, direct action, which we haven't seen the framework for, and I guess we'll see how the government goes in the Senate.
So a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, but if you were left to your own devices, would it still be column A?
Well, no. Look, the party's made a decision, and I think they are on the right side of history. I think we will end up with emissions trading schemes around the world, and I think they will be linked to one degree or another, and I think it's the most efficient way of dealing with climate change. But to a certain extent, once direct action is put into place, we will see well, the lack of merit in it, I guess.
And indeed we will. We're out of time now, but I'll be looking forward to getting you back, Kelly O'Dwyer, to discuss the merit of that market mechanism direct action when we get the opportunity. Kelly O'Dwyer, Nick Champion, appreciate your company on Australian Agenda. Thanks very much. Paul Kelly, as always, great to have your company as well. And thanks for watching this edition of Australian Agenda. We'll be back at the same time next Sunday. See you then.